Hey guys, Stockaholics, thank you guys for being here today. Shipping cycles are US inflation cycles. Every time the United States has gone through a period of high inflation throughout its history, that has directly led to there being a time in commercial shipping where there is very high earnings across the board for any kind of shipping segment. In this video, I am going to be comparing the Baltic Dry Index, and I'm going to be comparing that to some periods of time in which there was high inflation in the United States. Now, I believe that because the United States has the global reserve currency, whenever there is increasing amounts of dollars being created at any time, that causes there to be an increase in the demand for shipping as a result. Okay, here we go. 3 distinct Baltic dry cycles. This is a chart of real dry bulk freight rate index and its trend from 1850 to 2020. The Baltic Dry Index, it's an average of, I guess, all the rates that dry bulk segment is making at any given time. And this is adjusted for inflation. So it's a real dry bulk index going across time. And there are 3 distinct periods I wanted to kind of draw your attention to. And I'll get into that into a second, but I wanted to mention, first of all, this is taken from the Federal Reserve, actually. There's a Dallas branch in which they go and back and they kind of look throughout history at the dry bulk index. What they come to the conclusion of in this paper that they've made, I'll put a link to it somewhere below. They come to the conclusion that ultimately what drives the shipping cycles are periods where demand exceeds the given supply. And really, I think what drives the demand is ultimately these monetary creation cycles that we go through in the United States. Okay, so this first period I wanted to show you guys here, this is from basically 1940 to 1960 or so. You know, that was World War II. Eventually, we went on the United States dollar, I think right at the end of that, with the Bretton Woods Agreement. And during this period of time, you can see that there was just incredible amounts of shipping rates for the dry bulk sector during that time. Now, first of all, I would imagine this is also a supply situation too during that time. Of course, you just had World War II, and then I'm sure a tremendous amounts of boats were blown up during that time. Actually, that's basically what I think how you could explain why there was this uptick in the trend from basically 1910 until 1960, where those 2 world wars were probably a lot of boats were being blown up. But if you didn't have that, I would imagine the overall trend for dry bulk rates would go down with some brief periods of these periods of high demand exceeding supply. Okay, so that was that first one. In the 1970s, you can see there are these 3 distinct kind of little ticks over here where there were some sharp dry bulk rates. I believe this was a result of boomers and the United States housing during that time. You had an expansionary demographic of young adults all being crammed into an underbuilt housing market at the time. They were getting loans, and because we have something called the fractional reserve banking system, they were creating a bunch of dollars into the system. I know there's a lot of explanations out there for what caused the inflation in the 1970s. In my opinion, it was a giant increase in M2, and we're going to show you guys that in a little bit too. And then there's this last cycle over here from 2003 to 2008, where you see there's a big, also another sharp period of high dry bulk rates. This again, in my opinion, was also caused by a demographic not nearly as expansionary as it was in the 1970s, but over here you had the Gen Xers in the United States entering the United States housing market. Just like before, because we have that fractional reserve banking system, they created a bunch of dollars and they bought a bunch of houses, and that ended up having a result where there was a lot of demand, probably both because of this generation buying a bunch of commodities in the United States, but also because I think a lot of those dollars go and escape the United States. They go into the world economy, and then that kind of basically stimulates world GDP growth. And I think I've shown a chart before where you can really see that if you look at like the BRICS nations during that time, all of their GDP is going wildly higher during this period of time. That's because, which I'm going to show you next, is that US monetary creation. 3+1 distinct monetary cycles. This is a chart of M2 money supply growth versus inflation. So we have this black line over here. When you see that this black line is going up, that's telling you that there are periods of time when there is lots of dollars being created. And then you also notice that this red line, it also tends to lag this money creation by about a year or two, okay? I think this is because it takes time for people to realize in the general economy that there is more currency units going around. The prices don't go up instantly to reflect this M2 creation. It kind of feeds through the economy slowly over time, and then eventually it works its way through the entire system and gets through wages and everything like that over a period of time. Okay, so I wanted to show you guys this and compare it to those dry bulk rates that we saw in that last chart. Now, first of all, this is the 1940s. There is this red line over here. That's the measured inflation rate. You can see that there's kind of these three big waves over here from in the basically 1940 to 1950 something. And you can see basically the same idea over here in the dry bulk index. There was also these three distinct waves taking place during that time also, okay? Now, again, this is a lot of that government-driven inflation during this time. This wasn't so much demographic-driven, okay? Now, the second inflation cycle that we kind of had in the United States, I think it kind of, I thought people attribute it into the 70s a lot, I think economists and people like that. I think it actually started like around here, 1968. And that's because if you look at a picture of, the housing market, the amount of houses being created at any given time in the United States, there was a period where this was going up, and it kind of matches M2. So you kind of had this first smaller inflation wave in 1967, 68, and then you saw that inflation lag a little bit, and it kind of hit the system by 1970. You can also see that there's another hump over here, 1972. It kind of hit the system by 1975, and then there's that other M2 wave over here from 1975, 1977 or 78 or so, and then the inflation from that wave hit in 1980. You can look over here. You see these three distinct waves, and they basically match that inflation hitting the system, okay? When those prices are realized throughout the economy, when that M2 gets registered in goods and services in the economy, that is when it matches the shipping rates at that given time. Again, this is demographic driven. It's the boomers getting into housing years because we have the fractional reserve banking system. When they get housing loans, they create dollars into the economy, okay? This final wave, or this final Baltic dry cycle over here, this was from 2003 to 2008 was this last great historic shipping super cycle. And you'll look at this chart and you'll be like, what happened over here? There's a lot of M2 growth, but we don't really see that being reflected in this red line in this inflation rate. No, that's not largely because the United States changed the way they were measuring inflation. I think this is a result of rapid globalization happening during that time, and a lot of the inflation that we would have seen because of this the housing market and monetary expansion happening during this time, like we would have in the 70s, it didn't happen because all of that inflation was being exported. So a lot of the goods and services that we otherwise would have produced in the United States economy, a lot of that was coming from places like China, and so it wasn't really registered in the CPI and things like that. Now, I also wanted to make a point of this last cycle over here. Again, we had kind of a government-driven inflation cycle, and this was because the medical event and kind of the hysterical response to that, where the government printed a whole bunch of money. They did new kinds of loans, like the PPP loan, where they had government-backed private banking loans, was basically pure monetization, creating dollars into the system. And that also created a very large spike in M2. We can see that inflation is lagging that. And I think the inflation rate today is about 10% as measured by the CPI. Now, if I don't have a picture of it here, but what we just had is another dry bulk cycle. Again, from the last year and a half, we had a big spike in the Baltic Dry Index, and then today we're at slightly higher levels compared to the time before. Now, what I wanted to make a point of as I close this video is that just like before, we have an expansionary demographic like in the 1970s of young adults in their loan-aged years called the millennials. And we have them all being crammed into an underbuilt housing market. Now, I know there's a lot of very strong opinions out there about the housing market being in a bubble, and it's being overvalued. I think there's some merit to the prices being extremely overvalued, but at the same time, we don't have the houses to accommodate an expansionary demographic like we had in the 1970s. This period over here with the Gen Xers, their demographic was actually a lot smaller than the ones we have today with the millennials entering their home buying years. So it's really nuts because what happened is you had the government do basically a pure monetization of the economy and the money like they did in the 40s, right before you're entering a period like this in the 1970s, where you have, in my opinion, like another expansionary demographic of young adults entering their loan-aged years. And if you listen to some really smart people out there like Ray Dalio and Lynn Alden, they think that we are in the end of one of these long-term debt cycles too. So when I think about this and I think about the inflation that we could be seeing, and we go back, if that inflation we have continues, it could be, again, I'm not saying this is going to happen, but I think it's a real possibility where you see another period of time like the 40s where you just have a tremendously huge rate of growth in the dry bulk index, the rates. And by the way, all the shipping segments, they kind of parallel this to some extent. They're a little bit choppy, but if you look kind of back, if you look at the tanker index, I know there's a historical chart of that. There's a period in the 70s where you see these spikes. And again, in the tankers, there's a big spike like that there too. I'm not sure about in the 40s. I don't know if they had tankers back then. But yeah, so anyway, let me know what you guys think in the comments below. I think that we are in another shipping super cycle driven by largely U.S. monetary expansion. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Have a great day.